had always trusted Mark, believing that despite their busy lives, their marriage was built on a solid foundation. At 36, she was balancing work, motherhood, and family responsibilities, while Mark, 43, maintained a stable job to support their household. Their 5-year-old daughter, Emily, was the center of their world, and Sarah had never doubted that Mark was a loving father. Last week, Sarah had to return to her childhood home to care for her ailing grandmother, leaving Emily in Mark's care for 3 days. Normally, her mother handled the caregiving duties, but due to an unexpected illness, Sarah stepped in. Before leaving, she reassured herself that Mark could handle things at home. They often talked about the importance of trust in a relationship, and Sarah had no reason to suspect otherwise. However, fate had other plans. Sarah's mother recovered quicker than expected, allowing her to return home a day early. Excited at the thought of surprising Mark and Emily, she chose not to inform them in advance. She imagined the joy on their faces when she walked through the door, and with that thought in mind, she set off on the long drive home. Around 9 p.m., as she neared the city, Mark sent her a casual text. "Emily is asleep. I'm heading to bed soon. Hope everything went okay. Take care." Sarah smiled at the message, reassured that everything at home was normal. But as she pulled into their driveway at 2 a.m., exhaustion gave way to confusion. Mark's car was missing. Their household had 2 cars, and his was always parked in its usual spot by this hour. A chill ran down her spine as she scanned the quiet street. Then, in the dim glow of the streetlights, she spotted his car parked roughly 200 meters away in an unusually secluded area. Her heart pounded as she walked closer. At first, she thought she was overreacting, but then she noticed movement inside the vehicle. Her stomach dropped. The engine was off, but she could make out shifting shadows. Holding her breath, she stepped forward cautiously and peered inside. What she saw shattered her world. Mark was with another woman. Frozen in shock, Sarah barely registered the soft murmurs and muffled sounds of intimacy. A wave of nausea hit her as she realized the painful truth. The man she trusted, the father of her child, was betraying her in the most devastating way possible. At first, Sarah thought she was imagining things. Maybe she was just exhausted from the long drive. Maybe Mark had a perfectly reasonable explanation for why his car was parked in such an unusual spot at this hour. But as she took another step closer, any lingering hope shattered. The car wasn't empty, and the movements inside weren't innocent. Through the faint glow of the streetlights, she saw 2 figures inside. Her pulse quickened as she strained to see more clearly. The windows were slightly rolled down, and though her mind screamed at her to turn away, her body refused to move. Then she heard it. A woman's voice, breathless and intimate, whispering words she couldn't quite make out. The realization struck her like a physical blow. This wasn't just some late-night conversation. This wasn't just an innocent meeting. Mark was with another woman, and they were completely oblivious to the fact that Sarah was standing just outside, witnessing everything. A cold numbness spread through her body as she took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she couldn't move, couldn't think. The betrayal was unfolding right before her eyes, yet she felt paralyzed, as though she had stepped outside of her own body. Mark had sent her a message just a few hours ago, acting as though he was home, taking care of their daughter, while in reality, he was here, meeting someone else in the dead of night. Did he really think she would never find out? Did he feel no guilt at all? The weight of it all came crashing down on her at once. Emily. Their little girl was at home, sleeping alone while her father was out here, betraying the family they had built together. That thought finally broke through Sarah's paralysis. Her breath came in sharp, ragged bursts as she spun around and ran, her feet barely making a sound on the pavement. She didn't know where she was going. All she knew was that she needed to get away before the sobs rising in her throat gave her away. Her car was still parked in the driveway, but she didn't stop. She rushed inside her house, locking the door behind her as she leaned against it, gasping for breath. The house was silent, except for the rhythmic sound of Emily's breathing from her bedroom. Sarah wiped at her face, only then realizing she was crying. She walked into Emily's room, standing over her sleeping form. The little girl looked so peaceful, her small hand clutching a stuffed animal. How could Mark do this? How could he abandon their daughter in the middle of the night to sneak off with another woman? Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled the blankets up over Emily's tiny shoulders. This wasn't just about betrayal. This was about trust, about responsibility. And at that moment, as Sarah stood watching her daughter sleep, something shifted inside her. She wasn't just hurt anymore. She was angry. Sarah's hands were still shaking as she stepped out of Emily's room, her mind racing with a storm of emotions: disbelief, rage, heartbreak. She paced the dimly lit hallway, trying to process what she had just seen. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of Mark with that woman flashed behind her eyelids like a nightmare she couldn't escape. How long had this been going on? Was it really the first time, or had she simply been blind to the signs before? A bitter laugh escaped her lips. She had spent years trusting him, believing in the life they had built together, and in one night, that illusion had shattered into pieces. An hour passed, though it felt like mere minutes. Then, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway made her entire body tense. She walked to the window and peered through the blinds. It was Mark. He stepped out of his car, moving cautiously, almost hesitantly, as if he already knew something was wrong. Sarah didn't wait for him to enter. She marched to the front door and flung it open just as he reached for the handle. The moment their eyes met, she saw it. The flicker of panic, the way his face drained of color. He knew. He knew he had been caught. "You're home early," Mark said, forcing a weak smile, but his voice was tight, strained. Sarah crossed her arms, her entire body rigid with anger. "Cut the act, Mark. I saw everything." His smile disappeared instantly. He blinked rapidly, as if searching for a way to backtrack, to find an escape from the reality crashing down on him. "Sarah, Don't," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to slice through the tension between them. "I saw you. In the car. With her." The words tasted like poison on her tongue, but she refused to look away, refused to give him the chance to lie his way out of this. Mark inhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, his eyes darting toward the door, as if he was considering whether to step inside or turn and run. "Sarah, please. It's not what you think." Sarah let out a cold, humorless laugh. "Not what I think? You were with another woman, in your car, in the middle of the night while our daughter was home alone. Tell me, Mark, what exactly am I supposed to think?" For a moment, he said nothing. Then, with a heavy sigh, he finally admitted, "She's a coworker. She said she needed someone to talk to. I met her outside so we wouldn't wake Emily. One thing led to another, and..." His voice trailed off, his guilt painfully obvious. Sarah shook her head, disgusted. "So what? It just happened? That's your excuse?" Mark stepped closer, desperation in his voice. "It was a mistake. A terrible mistake. It didn't mean anything. I swear to you it was just that one time." Sarah didn't believe him, and worse, she wasn't sure she ever could again. Sarah stared at Mark, her jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. A mistake. That's what he called it. As if his betrayal was something that had simply slipped out of his hands, as if he had no control over his own actions. She wanted to scream at him, to demand how he could stand there and feed her such an empty excuse. But more than that, she wanted to understand. How could the man she had built a life with, the father of her child, make such a selfish, disgusting choice? Mark took another step toward her, his hands reaching out as if he thought she might let him hold her, as if that would somehow erase what he had done. "Sarah, please," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I swear, I never meant for this to happen. She kissed me first. I knew it was wrong, but I let it happen. It meant nothing. I don't even have feelings for her." Sarah took a step back, shaking her head in disbelief. "You let it happen? That's all you have to say?" Her voice rose, and she had to remind herself that Emily was sleeping upstairs. "Do you think that makes it better? Do you think that saying it meant nothing somehow makes it hurt less?" Mark exhaled, his shoulders slumping. "I know I messed up, but I don't want to lose you, Sarah. I love you. I love our family. I'll do anything to fix this." Sarah let out a sharp breath, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Fix this?" She gestured toward the door, toward the dark street where his car had been parked just an hour ago. "You can't take this back, Mark. You left our daughter alone in the middle of the night to go sleep with another woman. And what, were you just going to sneak back in and pretend nothing happened? Were you going to kiss me goodnight like everything was normal?" Mark squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, his expression twisting with shame. "I wasn't thinking," he admitted. "I wasn't. God, I wasn't thinking about anything but the moment. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging you. Please, don't let this be the end of us." Sarah felt her chest tighten. 5 days ago, she would have sworn that nothing could break them, that no matter what challenges they faced, they would always find a way through. But now she wasn't sure if she could even stand to be in the same room as him. Every time she looked at him, all she could see was his hands on another woman, his mouth pressed against lips that weren't hers. She swallowed hard. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Mark," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't even know if I want to." Mark flinched as if the words physically hurt him, but Sarah didn't care. She wasn't ready to make this easy for him. Not after what he had done. For the past 5 days, Sarah had felt trapped in a cycle of emotions: anger, disgust, sorrow, betrayal. Every time she looked at Mark, a fresh wave of nausea rolled over her. She couldn't unsee what she had witnessed that night, couldn't silence the echoes of that woman's voice, the undeniable proof of Mark's infidelity. It replayed in her mind like a cruel, never-ending loop. And yet, despite the unbearable weight of it all, she hadn't made a decision. She hadn't left. Not yet. Mark had been walking on eggshells since she confronted him, hovering around her like a ghost, desperate for redemption. He tiptoed through the house, keeping his distance but watching her with pleading eyes, waiting for her to say something, anything, that might suggest he had a chance to make things right. He had apologized 100 times, sworn that it was a one-time mistake, that he had no real feelings for the woman. But Sarah didn't believe him. How could she? A man who was capable of sneaking out in the dead of night to betray his wife while his child slept alone was a man she no longer recognized. What made her angriest, though, was the fact that she hadn't completely shattered. A part of her wanted to scream, to throw things, to demand he leave. But another part of her, the part that had spent over a decade loving him, building a life with him, felt paralyzed. She hated him, but she also hated the thought of tearing their family apart. And then there was Emily, sweet, innocent Emily, who still ran into her father's arms with absolute trust, who had no idea that the foundation of her family had already begun to crack. Sarah wasn't sure what scared her more, staying with a man she could never trust again, or leaving and destroying the only stability Emily had ever known. Could she really raise their daughter in a house filled with resentment and unspoken anger? Or was it worse to make Emily grow up in a broken home? Mark approached her cautiously that evening, his voice soft, almost pleading. "Sarah, I love you. I love Emily. I know I hurt you, but please don't throw everything away over one mistake." Sarah looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time she realized the truth. He had already thrown it away,